Hey guys, so it's been a while since we've done a video. I am going to go ahead and combine two different chapters. So if you're looking through the readings and you see that this isn't a part of Mendelian inheritance, just know that I've skipped a chapter and gone on to the next, which is talking about humans and our genes. So in the past or recently, we've learned about Mendelian genetics. And it's important to know that yes, there are dominant and recessive traits, and yes, those things separate independently of one another, but there are also factors that affect humans that don't necessarily affect other species. So for example, with dominant and recessive traits, it doesn't always mean that someone will get blue eyes with blonde hair or so on and so forth. And yes, there is a link to that, but there's a little bit more that goes on than just dominant and recessive relationships. So I wanted to make sure we talked about that. So in this section, we're going to be talking about human chromosomes and genes. Mostly in this section, we're just going to introduce the idea of the human genome, some research that was done for that, and then talk about how sex determination happens. You'll notice that in most of these slides, I have shortened the notes quite a bit. And so obviously on this one, there's only two points. I will be adding things in class, so make sure you leave room in between slides. In regards to how much information, I can't really say, but it's always good to leave room. You guys kind of already know that drill. So I've definitely already talked about the idea that you are super unique in who you are. There's nobody out there that has the genes that you have, only because the fact that we have so much that makes up our DNA. So nobody is identical to you. Now, if you were an identical twin, this is a case where you would have obviously your genes would be identical to one another, but you'd still have some differences just based off the fact of your environment, and that not everybody and not individual people experience the exact same thing on the exact same day every single day. So that gets me into the idea of what's known as the human genome. So in the next few chapters, we're going to start talking about DNA. But right now, all I want you to know is that DNA is the stuff that makes us up. So all the DNA of the human species makes up what's known as the human genome. This DNA, it consists of a lot of billions and billions of what's known as base pairs. And these base pairs come together and they create that huge DNA double helical structure. Within that helical structure, they come together, and all of those helical structures are found within our chromosomes. 23 pairs of chromosomes if you are a human. The human genome also includes what's known as non-coding sequences of DNA, and that just means DNA that's not responsible for coding any type of gene. And like I said, we'll get into that in more detail in later chapters, but right now, please know that DNA is responsible for making you who you are. So thanks to the huge efforts of the scientists involved with what's known as the Human Genome Project, we have a DNA sequence of the entire human genome, meaning we know what codes of life make up a human. And so part of the project is identifying the genes in the sequences, or what codes make up the genes that make up the traits. So that's a huge undertaking. Again, the Human Genome Project, huge undertaking by a lot of scientists around the world, and basically they're just trying to identify those different codes. So it's cracking the code, really. So I lied in the beginning of the video. I totally forgot about this slide. There is a ton to write here. I'm sorry. I don't really know what else to say. Okay, big things you need to know, though, is that chromosomes and genes, they go hand in hand with one another. So each species has a characteristic number of chromosomes, meaning the number of chromosomes that a species has basically dictates what type of species you are. Now, just because humans have 23 doesn't mean that that's the most an organism can have. There are organisms that are of lower intelligence that have more chromosomes than we do. The human species just so happens to be categorized by 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 individual chromosomes. You can break those two types of chromosomes, or you can break the chromosomes down into two different types. You have what's known as autosomes and sex chromosomes. Autosomes are 22 pairs of our chromosomes. So pairs 1 through 22 are what's known as autosomes. They're chromosomes that contain genes for characteristics that are unrelated to sex. So they don't code for the sex. These chromosomes are the same in males and females. Great majority of human genes are located on autosomes, which is probably a good thing, because if everything was coded on a Y chromosome, that means that males would be the species that survives, basically. In contrast to autosomes, we have what's known as sex chromosomes. And this is the last set of human chromosomes, and it's made up of either an X and a Y chromosome or a XX chromosome. There's no such thing as a Y by itself. There can be such thing as an O or X by itself, and we'll talk about those disorders later on. So females have 2 X chromosomes and males have 1 X and 1 Y chromosome. In females, it's really important. I didn't put this on the slide, but I will add this to your notes. In females, one of those X chromosomes in each cell is inactivated, and that's known as a Barr body. And that just makes sure that females, like males, only have one functioning copy of the X chromosome in each cell. So if your mom happens to pass on some defects on that X chromosome, that stinks because that's all you're getting from your mom. And then we have what's known as the Y chromosome. And the Y chromosome is much shorter than the X chromosome. It has about 100 genes compared to the X chromosome that has about 2,000. The Y chromosomes genes are pretty much, they're important because that Y chromosome actually has a gene called the SRY gene, which stands for sex determining region. And that's the region of the gene, or excuse me, of the chromosome that actually codes for sex. All the other genes, not super related to any vital function when it comes to survival. So like I said, pretty much all of the Y genes are associated with sex determination in comparison to all the X chromosome genes that are unrelated to sex in any way. So the woman has no say-so in what sex the offspring will come out to be. Without the Y chromosome, an individual develops into a female. So you can always think of the default sex for a species and what's known as female. So you can have like an X0 genotype for sex, and they have other issues that arise that particular type of person, but we will get into that later. Human genes. So roughly we have about 20,000 to 22,000 genes, which is quite a few, but not as much as a species can have. Like I said, we have a lot of chromosomes, but that doesn't mean we have the most. We have a lot of genes, but that does not mean we have the most. There are simpler species that have a lot more genes than we do. However, humans have these great capabilities that we can do with our DNA. We can do what's known as splicing and other processes to make proteins that allow for much more diversity within our species. So we don't look exactly the same like a lot of other species do. Of the 3 billion base pairs in the human genome, only about 25% make up genes and their regulatory elements. And so what I mean by that is only a portion of our coding actually does things we need it to do. The rest is what's known as non-coding sequences. And right now, that's all I want you to know is that there is non-coding sequences, but don't worry about what else it can do for now. The majority of human genes have 2 or more possible alleles. You should know this already. Differences in alleles account for the considerable genetic variation among people. So yes, your brother and you could have the exact same parents. You guys could get essentially almost all of the same kind of makeup in your DNA, but you look different than they do because of the way that your genes are paired with one another. So you both may have blonde hair and blue eyes, but one of you may have freckles and the other one may not. One of you may tan really well while the other does not. So there are huge genetic variations between you and your brothers and sisters and you and the rest of the world. So that genetic variation is just a result of the differences in each individual's DNA. And then last but certainly not least, we have what's known as linkage. And linkage is the idea that genes that are located on the same chromosomes are called linked genes. The closer these genes are to one another, the more likely it is that you are going to inherit those genes together. So alleles for these genes tend to segregate together during meiosis, unless crossing over happens. Remember, we talked about that. Crossing over is a piece of the chromosome that's taken off and traded with the homologous chromosome. And this is very much a possibility. So linkage is a good way to explain why certain characteristics are inherited with one another. So like redheads typically have blue eyes, typically blonde hair has blue eyes. Doesn't mean you'll always have that, but there is that trend of inheritance together. Eye color and hair color are genes that are found on the same chromosome, so they have a linkage to them. Another one could be brown hair and brown eyes. Those are typically inherited with one another. Can you think of any other traits that occur together? Maybe freckles and red hair, I'm really drawing a blank here on any other traits, so maybe in class you guys can come up with a good list. Sex-linked genes. So genes located on the sex chromosomes are what's called sex-linked genes or X-linked genes, because most of the genes that we find on our sex chromosomes are on the X chromosome, but we'll just call them sex-linked. Due to the fact that females and males, I guess females have two X chromosomes, and that distinguishes them from males who have XY chromosomes. The males will inherit anything and everything that their mother gave them. So whatever chromosome or whatever genes on that X chromosome that they got come from their mother. And in the same respect, similar to females, but again, they get two X chromosomes from their mom and their dad. You don't know which chromosome is inactivated or has that bar body on it. There has been significant research in the past and even now that maps different genes or creates like what's known as linkage. And basically what I'm trying to say is that linkage can be assessed by determining how often crossing over occurs between two genes on the same chromosome. So if genes show up in different gametes less than 50% of the time, that is, they tend to be inherited together, they are assumed to be on homologous chromosomes. They may be separated by crossing over, but that's pretty less likely to occur because they're so much closer to one another. The lower the frequency of crossing over, the closer together on the same chromosome the genes are presumed to be. So frequencies of crossing overs can be used to construct what's known as a linkage map. And the linkage map, it just basically shows the location of genes on a chromosome. I went through a lot of information on here. I know. So if you have any questions, please make sure you're asking me on Edpuzzle. I'll go through this information much slowly, give you examples in class, so please don't freak out just yet.